The Underground Man, Fyodor Dostoevsky's warning to the world's darkest truth. Some minds aren't broken by chaos, they're broken by clarity. In this video, we explore Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, not just a novel, but a psychological prophecy through the eyes of the underground man. Dostoevsky warns of a world where reason replaces soul, and awareness becomes paralysis, drawing from existential psychology. We examine how hyper-consciousness, repressed suffering, and emotional rebellion shape the modern mind. You'll discover why too much intellect can become a prison, why suffering becomes addictive, and how rebellion is often the last cry for freedom. This isn't just a reflection on a character, it's a mirror for anyone who has ever felt stuck, overthinking, unseen, or afraid to live honestly. Dostoevsky doesn't give us answers, but he gives us something more powerful, the courage to confront our darkness and begin again. When reason fails to save humanity, a warning from the 19th century. In 1864, Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky published a strange and haunting work, Notes from Underground, not merely a novel, but a dire warning written from the deepest layers of the human soul. While Russian society was enthralled with ideas of reform, progress, rationalism, and socialism, Dostoevsky went against the tide. He wrote about a man who refused to step into the light, a man who lived in darkness, not because he was punished, but because he had lost all faith in the promises of reason. This work is considered not only one of the first foundations of existentialism, but also a profound dialogue between man and the absurdity of his own existence. It was written in opposition to the dominant ideas of the time: utilitarianism, extreme rationalism, determinism, atheism, and the belief that a perfect society could be engineered through science and logic. These ideologies, Dostoevsky feared, not only shaped collective thinking, but were eroding the inner life of the individual. He sensed the danger that if humanity placed all its faith in reason, in calculations of happiness, in the common good, then one day, people would no longer know who they are, and worse, they wouldn't even care. In a piercing passage, he wrote, "I say, let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea." This is not mere selfishness, but a tired, prideful, and despairing reaction to systems that, in the name of reason, stripped away all humanity. At the time, Russian nihilism was on the rise, young radicals rejecting all traditional values. But rather than criticize them directly, Dostoevsky created a character, the underground man, as a manifestation of the inner fragmentation he saw in that generation. A man who believed in neither God nor universal truth, in neither goodness nor order, only in contradiction, doubt, and self-loathing. And yet, beneath the bleakness of his words lies a profoundly human message. If reason can no longer save us, then perhaps only a conscious embrace of suffering, of compassion, and of the courage to face ourselves can lead us back to wholeness. Notes from Underground was written like a distorted mirror, not to frighten readers, but to help them recognize their own face when all faith in a rational utopia has collapsed. And in that shattered space, individual will, spiritual freedom, and awakened consciousness remain the last flickers of light in the darkest basement of the soul. Man in the shadows. When consciousness becomes a prison, no name, no clear background, no social status, the protagonist of Notes from Underground is known only by a single title, the underground man. He lives not in a home, but in a kind of cave, a basement, a dark recess, not only a physical space, but a metaphor for a psychological condition entirely cut off from the outside world. This man is not punished by anyone, he chooses to live there. His excessive awareness, his acute consciousness of both himself and the world, becomes the very sentence that imprisons him for 40 years. I am a sick man, I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. The book begins not with a confession, but with a direct self-condemnation. He lacks the ignorance to deceive himself, the carefree nature to let things slide. Every action, every thought, every impulse is dissected under a cold light of analysis, and that very light burns his soul, day after day. He believes he has a liver problem, but he refuses to see a doctor, not out of fear, but out of stubbornness, a form of passive resistance. Fiercely intense, he rejects goodness, refuses care, as a way to punish himself for knowing too much, yet failing to live rightly. This is not mere depression, but a state of hyper-consciousness where one knows they are wrong, refuses to correct it, and even derives twisted satisfaction from the self-destruction. He does not hate others with rage, but through cold, sarcastic prose. He does not love anyone because he has never truly believed himself worthy of being loved. His sense of self-worth has been eroded by a society full of illusions. We are told that if we are intelligent, we will be happy. If we are analytical, we will succeed. But the underground man represents, and Dostoevsky mourns this heartbreaking truth, that at times, the more we understand, the more powerless we become. He knows he is destroying himself, but he does not stop. In his diary, he writes, "I know there are opposing impulses within me. They torment me, disgust me, and eventually drive me insane. But I don't let them out. I repress them. I deliberately torture my soul. This is a darkness fully aware of itself, not a battle to escape, but a resigned acceptance of it as inevitable, and worse still, it becomes familiar. It becomes safe." What makes the underground man so universal, transcending 19th century Russia, is that he is not just a specific individual. He is a symbol of every soul that has ever fallen into self-denial, feeling not enough in a world that celebrates only success, reason, optimism, and extroversion. He represents that quiet part in each of us, that skeptical observer, retreating inward, into a space where no one judges, but where no one truly reaches us either. And it is there, in that deepest, most hidden corner, where if no light ever shines, one might remain forever, thinking they are safe, but in reality, slowly rotting away, the helplessness of the thinker, a sharp mind, frozen in place. There is a cruel paradox that Dostoevsky forces the underground man to live with for his entire life. The more intelligent he is, the less he is able to live. Society teaches us that knowledge is power, that reason will guide us through fear, help us make sound decisions, and lead to success. But Notes from Underground exposes a truth few dare to admit sometimes. Excessive awareness does not liberate us, it paralyzes us. The underground man is no fool. He is educated, deeply introspective, hypersensitive to the subtlest movements of his own mind and of others, but instead of using that awareness to act, he drowns in endless loops of logic. Every decision is dissected. Every reaction is doubted. Every emotion is explained to the point where it loses all vitality. Dostoevsky draws a distinction between two types of people, those who act and those who are overly self-aware. The former are unburdened by inner conflict. They live, work, love, hate, decide partly because they do not ask too many questions. They are not trapped in the prison of infinite analysis. The underground man is the latter type, hyper-aware, hyper-analytical, and therefore immobile. He tells a story. A man stands before a stone wall, a metaphor for objective reality, natural law, and social order. Instead of turning away, he repeatedly bangs his head against it, knowing full well it's futile, not because he's stupid, but because he refuses to accept the unchangeable truth. He refuses to believe that life has limits and that we must live within them. The most tragic part is, he knows he is powerless. He does not deny it, but rather than search for another path, he remains locked in this state of lucid paralysis, gradually turning it into his identity. I could not become anything, not evil, not good, not vile, not noble. I lived quietly in my corner, reminding myself that only fools succeed in life. This is not just a complaint. It is a psychological portrait that many in the modern world can relate to people who think too much, who see all sides of an issue and, as a result, cannot move forward. Every choice leads to consequences, so they choose to do nothing, and doing nothing, over time, becomes its own silent suffering, a slow but persistent death. Yet what makes this section of Dostoevsky's work especially powerful is the implicit question he poses to us. If too much awareness renders you powerless, what choice do you have left? If you cannot live superficially, if you cannot ignore the truth, how do you keep living without being crushed by your own mind? The answer, from a healing perspective, may not be to stop thinking, but to transform thinking into meaningful action. Rather than being trapped inside our heads, we must learn to steer our awareness toward the heart, toward connection, toward life. Awareness is a gift, but if you don't use it to live, it becomes a punishment. The underground man is a mirror of useless introspection. But if we stop before it's too late, if we learn to ask questions that move us forward, not bury us deeper than reason can cease being a prison, and become the doorway to true freedom. Distorted pleasure. When suffering becomes an addiction, there is a passage in Notes from Underground that no one who has ever experienced self-loathing can read without feeling a sting in the heart. It is when the underground man describes coming home after a disgraceful night, knowing he has just acted with cruelty, and instead of feeling remorse, he feels a secret pleasure, a silent delight in sinking deeper into his own wreckage. And I quietly, silently tormented myself, reproached myself, tore at my own soul, until that bitterness turned into a cursed kind of pleasure, and then strangely into a real joy. This is one of Dostoevsky's most iconic lines, not just for its literary force, but because it exposes a little discussed psychological mechanism. Humans can become addicted to suffering, not physical pain, but a type of emotional torment that one deliberately prolongs, replays, and digs into just to feel that they still exist. The underground man doesn't self-sabotage because he doesn't know better. On the contrary, he knows too well. But within that awareness, in his razor-sharp insight into his own failures, he finds a sense of control. At least this is his pain. Chosen by him, no one forced it on him. No one sees it. No one understands it. And no one can interfere. That feeling of absolute solitude and absolute agency gradually becomes a kind of addiction. And like all addictions, it starts subtly, but the longer it lasts, the deeper it distorts the emotional system. People begin to mistake torment for depth. They confuse pain with authenticity, and worse, they confuse suffering with identity. In the underground man's world, suffering is no longer something to avoid. It is what keeps him alive. He is addicted to the feeling of being wounded, because only then does he feel real. He invents injuries, fabricates slights, forces himself to believe in humiliations just to immerse himself in the experience of being rejected, abandoned, and despised. I have that many times deliberately humiliated myself just to feel wounded, just to have a reason to exist as the victim. This is the mechanism of a soul deeply wounded yet incapable of self-love, a mind so accustomed to darkness that light itself begins to seem suspicious. What makes this passage vital to us is not that the underground man is strange, but that we see ourselves in him, who hasn't clung to an old wound, replaying it like a tape in their mind, as if the more it hurt, the more it proved they had once loved, once lived, once mattered. Dostoevsky did not write to judge, he wrote so that we might admit the truth, that, at times, we are the ones feeding our own pain. But in that admission, he opens a different possibility, that if we can choose to inflict pain on ourselves, we can also learn to choose self-compassion and forgiveness. The key is not to run from suffering, but to understand what drives it, to realize you don't need to suffer to know you're alive. You can choose to live with kindness toward yourself by stopping, laying down the burden, and no longer demanding that you be hurt again just to prove something. Perhaps what most needs healing is not the pain, but the old belief that you deserve it. Rebellion as survival. When humans resist logic as instinct, are human beings truly rational creatures? As we like to believe, or beneath the polished surface of reason lies a deeper instinct, the instinct to rebel, even against systems built for our own good. The underground man does not believe in artificial paradises. He does not believe that building a perfectly comfortable, orderly, and happy world will make people virtuous. He argues that even if immersed in abundance, people will still rebel just to prove they cannot be controlled. To him, the idea of the crystal palace, a symbol of a flawless society built on reason, calculation, and synthetic morality, is a dangerous illusion, a place without conflict, without mistakes, without true freedom. In such a world, where everything is predetermined, humans no longer choose, they merely comply, and in that, freedom dies. I reject the crystal palace. For one reason, I cannot stick out my tongue at it. That line is not just a declaration. It's a blow to the radiant rationalism flourishing across 19th century Europe. Dostoevsky wasn't criticizing progress, but blind faith in a life that could be reduced to mathematics. He shows that humans will act against their own interests just to assert their free will. We cannot be programmed like machines. We do not merely want to live right. We want to live real, and real life is often full of mistakes. Chaos and uncertainty, self-destruction. Rebellion, apathy are not always signs of madness. They can be the final cry of a self that has been suppressed too long. When one is no longer allowed to define what is wrong, then even what is right loses meaning. We would rather smash everything than live in a world where even joy is prescribed. Dostoevsky goes further, arguing that humans might reject all good things, health, happiness, prosperity, just to preserve their right to choose suffering, not because they love pain, but because pain proves they are free. No one can force us to be happy. No one can program our emotions, dreams, or decisions. And that very irrationality, that illogical rebellion, is what prevents us from becoming piano keys. As he once wrote, shower upon man every earthly blessing, and even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. We are not numbers. We are not products of social equations. We are living souls with dreams, sorrows, doubt, and stubbornness that does not need fixing, it needs understanding. If the underground man had one thing to say, perhaps it would be this: I don't want to be right, I want to be free. For in error, we still have freedom. And in that seemingly meaningless rebellion, we sometimes rediscover ourselves. True freedom doesn't come from intellect, but from conscious suffering in a world led by the light of science, reason, and glittering achievements like the Crystal Palace, where everything can be measured, calculated, and optimized. Dostoevsky wrote something that seemed irrational Freedom is not found in intellect. Freedom only comes when we suffer and accept that suffering. To the underground man, what makes humans dangerous and truly human is not their logical thinking, but their capacity to resist logic. Humans act irrationally, harm themselves, go against their own interests, not out of stupidity, but out of free will, and free will cannot be tamed by any formula. When humans stop suffering, when they are programmed to avoid all discomfort, all uncertainty, all risk, when they only live right and no longer live real, then they lose the very essence of being, the right to feel, to fail, to break down and rise again through their own will. The underground man saw a world slowly replacing will with programming, replacing life with predictability, and he opposed it not through speeches, but through his very existence. A man who did not conform, did not act, did not fit, but also did not yield. He wrote, "If I cannot change anything, then at least I will not pretend to be okay with it. I will not let anyone force me to feel rational." It is a quiet but fierce manifesto, a declaration that suffering is not an enemy of humanity. It is part of it, not because we love pain, but because in pain, we awaken, we remember that we are alive, we stop running. And in that moment, when we no longer fear suffering, but face it, that is when freedom begins. A freedom not to choose between right and wrong by external standards, but the freedom to be ourselves, even if that self is flawed, broken, and contradictory. Dostoevsky did not glorify suffering. He showed that if we only try to escape pain, we also flee from freedom. If everything is predictable, then nothing is chosen. If every action is the result of rational necessity, then we are nothing more than products of circumstance. That's why he let the underground man exist as a counterexample, a man fully aware, yet inert, a man in pain, yet unbroken, a man who knows what is right, yet refuses to live by it, because he refuses to follow anything he did not freely choose. You may not want to be like the underground man, but perhaps you need to listen to him to remember true freedom is not about living right. It's about daring to live real. Intellect is not the only path, especially if it causes you to lose yourself. And suffering is not the enemy if it brings you back to your heart. True freedom does not come from understanding everything, but from accepting even what you cannot understand, and still choosing to move forward on your own feet. Returning from the dark, when facing yourself, is the first step to healing. We have traveled through the underground chamber, where the underground man has locked himself away for decades. We've witnessed him dissecting himself, tearing through layers of emotion, tormenting every thought, and imprisoning himself in a state of hyper-awareness that to outsiders might seem like madness. But in truth, he is not mad. He is completely lucid. And it is that very lucidity that has driven him into darkness. Yet amidst all the self-inflicted wounds and inner turmoil, one thing stands out. The underground man never denies his darkness. On the contrary, he stares directly into it. No embellishments, no excuses, no blame. In every line of biting sarcasm and bitterness, there remains an unflinching honesty, a rare confrontation between a man and the part of his mind he had long rejected. That's why, even though he doesn't live well, even though he doesn't act rightly, he remains a character who can lead us toward healing, not because he has overcome his pain, but because he shows us healing does not begin with change, it begins with truth. The underground man does not blame society, his childhood, or those who hurt him. He asks no one to understand him or fix him. He simply writes. He writes the truth as he sees it. He writes about the ugliness, the wretchedness, the self-disgust within him that no one wants to hear, but he writes it anyway, because that's the only way he knows to hold on to the awareness that he still exists. And that matters deeply. When we dare to speak the truths that even we find repulsive, we begin to reclaim agency over our inner world. We are no longer letting the darkness manipulate us silently. We call it by name. We drag it into the light. As Jung once said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. At this point, Notes from Underground is no longer a pessimistic novel. It becomes an invitation to return a whisper from the depths. If you are feeling miserable, meaningless, stuck in your own mind, you are not alone. And what you need is not to fix yourself, but to stop and listen. Healing begins with truth, not the truths others impose on you, but the truth you carry inside, even if it's messy, contradictory, and hard to accept. Maybe you're like the underground man, telling yourself you're despicable, useless, unworthy of love. But if you know that and acknowledge it, instead of hiding from it, you are already a step ahead of millions who never stop to ask, who am I, really? Not everyone lives authentically, but anyone can begin by being honest with themselves. And that first confrontation, however painful, however raw, is the essential first step of healing. Dostoevsky didn't offer a formula for overcoming suffering, but he gave us a mirror, not to look at ourselves, but through ourselves to see that, in darkness, if we are brave enough not to look away, light may just begin from there. Holding onto the self, living without needing to be understood. One of the greatest pains of the underground man is the feeling of not being recognized. No one understands him. No one sees the depths in which he dwells, and no one bothers to pause and truly listen to him. But the more painful truth is this: he still longs to be seen. Even though he outwardly displays contempt, he calls himself a mouse, a small, pitiful creature hiding in a basement, burrowing in thoughts no one cares about. Yet he cannot live without others. He cannot bear indifference. He cannot accept his existence as invisible and unacknowledged. And so he falls into a dangerous loop, hating others for not understanding him, while despising himself for needing their validation. Here, Dostoevsky touches one of the deepest contradictions in human psychology. We want to be ourselves, but we also want others to accept that self. And in many cases, we'd rather abandon who we are than live in isolation. But the underground man, in the tragedy of his being, leaves us with a valuable message. Sometimes, being true to yourself does not mean being understood. It means having the courage to accept the loneliness that truth may bring. There are paths that only you can walk. There are inner states no one but you can explain. And there are truths that only become part of you when you're brave enough to carry them alone. So holding on to yourself is not about proving anything. It's not about shouting to the world to validate your identity. It's about the quiet strength of no longer needing to, of standing firm, even when others turn away, of continuing to live, even without applause or approval. The greatest freedom is not getting what you want. It's not being shaken when no one stands beside you. Awakening is not theory, but small acts each day. The underground man is the symbol of hyper-awareness to the point of paralysis. He sees through every mask of life, the pretense, the hollow morals, the mechanical logic, the polite society. But because of this, he is unable to move. The clearer his vision, the more stuck he becomes, and he stays there, inactive, unmoving, going nowhere. We who live in an age of information, analysis, and constant vigilance often resemble him. We know too much about our pain, but too little about how to walk through it. We see the problems in society, in relationships, in ourselves, but we remain still. We fear being wrong, not good enough, not rational enough. And so awakening becomes a burden instead of a liberation. But if awakening doesn't lead to action, It becomes merely a mirror reflecting our helplessness. Dostoevsky didn't write The Underground Man to encourage us to be like him. He wrote to remind us, understanding is the beginning, but courage is the salvation. Awakening doesn't have to mean changing your whole life. It starts with very small acts, listening to yourself before pleasing others, saying no once when it matters, writing down what you feel, choosing not to check your phone first thing in the morning. Awakening is when you stop living on autopilot. Stop repeating habits just because they're familiar. Stop avoiding yourself because you're afraid to feel. Healing, freedom, returning to your true self, these don't come through grand transformations. They come from repeating the choice to live honestly, a little more each day, without needing approval, without needing company, as long as you keep walking. Notes from Underground is not just a warning from a man living in darkness. It is a mirror reflecting all of us, those who think we're living in the light, yet remain imprisoned in our own private basements of doubt, unspoken pain, and roles we no longer believe in. Dostoevsky offers no clear exit, but he gives us something far more precious, the courage to look directly at the place we've avoided the longest ourselves. And maybe that is the beginning of a life that doesn't have to be perfect or rational, but can be real. The beginning of a journey that doesn't need to end, but that you can walk on your own terms, with awareness, freedom, and aliveness.